Today's daf, we're going to be learning a Sanhedrin daf Kafchet. Today's daf is sponsored by Diane Kusher. My love and gratitude to Rabbanit Michelle for her teaching, to Goldie and Debbie for their hospitality and friendship, and all you dafarim during my wonderful time here at home in Israel. Leaving back today ASCP. Today's daf is sponsored by Viti Rosenzweig Konis in loving memory of her brother Eliyahu David ben Sarah B'Shmuel. Okay, we're going to get started with our daf. We have a bit of a complicated daf. This is one of the harder dafim about all the relatives. Spent a long time creating these presentations that I hope will help make things much clearer. So we're going to start without them because in the meantime, we're in the middle of the drasha. We want to find out what is the source for krovim. We started yesterday with what's the source for the fact that people can't testify for each other, relatives. And we started with Yulo Yum Tu Avot Abanim. It's a pasuk from Sefer Devarim, Perek Kaf Dalet, Pasuk Tet Zayin, and it says, fathers can't die for sons, sons can't die for their fathers, everybody dies for their own sins. It's a really redundant Pasuk, because if everyone dies for their own sins, obviously then sons don't die for fathers, fathers don't die for sons. What is the point of this coming to teach you? Well, the drasha comes and says, it's teaching you that fathers don't die if their sons testify against them. Sons don't die if their fathers testify against them. And what they really mean is not just when they say fathers, they mean two fathers, meaning two brothers and their sons, meaning not just father-son, but father-nephew. Okay? Their brother's son also can't testify. So with that, you've gotten four relatives, brothers, nephews, right? I don't know if you call that four, right? Brothers, nephews to the uncles. Okay? That's forbidden. So Eshkachan, and then we got off on a side tangent, which I'm not going to review anymore, but we talked about that very interesting philosophy class about, or don't we die for our own sins? Do we die for other people's sins? And what about Kol Yisrael Arim Zebazeh? We had three different differentiations at the end of the daf. Okay, starting with our daf. Eshkachan avot lebanim ubanim la'avot. So now we got basically uncles and sons and fathers. Kol sheken avot lahadade. Now, and this is a really important principle you're going to have to understand, which I think is pretty basic, and I think it's pretty inherent, and it's pretty obvious if you look at your own relationships in your families. The closest of people are going to be the siblings. Once you get to the second generation, it's already more distant, right? They don't grow up in the same family. So the relationship of a father to a nephew, a person to his nephew, or a nephew to the uncle, is always going to be less close than the father to each other. So if the fathers can't testify for their nephews, and nephews can't testify for their uncles, all the more so, the brothers can't obviously testify for each other. Because the first generation is where they're the closest. And we're going to talk today about first generation, second generation, and third generation, right? As you go down the family tree, already for sure, when you get to the third generation, right, they're already much more distant from each other. You're talking about second cousins already. But banim lebanim minalan, how do we know that the first cousins can't testify for each other? Because the first cousins are obviously more distant than even the uncle to the cousin, right, to the nephew. The uncle to the nephew, his connection is much closer because he's got the close connection to the nephew's father. But when you get down to the cousins, right, we all know, I mean, I don't know, maybe you don't, maybe you do, but there's always cousins you're closer with, cousins you're less close with. I mean, obviously the same thing could happen with siblings. Siblings, you all grow up together. So there's a certain closeness no matter what. But once you get down already to the second generation with each other is more distance than first generation with second generation. Okay, that's the idea, that there's this distance as we get down. How do we know the cousins can testify for each other? It says avod al banim banim al avod. It doesn't say banim lebanim. Im ken lichtov kra lo yimtu avot al ben my banim dafilu banim lahadadi. So again, we're going to continue with these drashot in the pasuk, which again, you can read it this way. You don't have to read it this way. And the whole pasuk theoretically could just be a repetitive pasuk. Sons don't die for their father's sins. Fathers don't die for their sons' sins. That's the way we've always done this to this pasuk. Everybody dies for their own sin, even though it's repetitive. That could be what it means. But the world of drasha, you're always allowed to learn other things. So they say it could have said father for a son. Why does it say sons in plural? To teach you sons for each other. Meaning, again, it doesn't mean sons for each other. It means cousins. First, cousins can't testify for each other. Okay, well, so far, all we talked about is one relative testifying for another relative. But banim la'alma minalan. But how do we get the two relatives can't testify together for somebody else, right? If we go to court or we want to sign a document for something, if we're cousins, we can't testify together. If we're siblings, we can't testify together for somebody else. So how do we know that? Well, we're going to answer. We're going to have two answers to this question. And what's the first answer? Amar Rambi Barhama, we're going to reject his answer Svarahu, he says it's logical. Now, we'll talk about the logic of this, okay, but it's going to be based on a source. It's not just outside logic, it's logic within halacha, based on halacha. Kidditanya, as it says in a Braita. If we both testify together, let's say we're cousins and we testify together, and let's say we lied about someone that they murdered someone. Now, if we become edim zamimim, we get the death penalty. But we won't get the death penalty if, let's say, only I became an eid zomim. Let's say two witnesses came and said, Michelle, there's no way you could have done this, but, right? There's no way you could have done this because you were with us on this and this day, and they knocked me out. Now, at that point, the testimony falls, right? We can't do anything. On the other hand, what happens? On the other hand, I don't get the punishment of getting killed, which I'm supposed to get, kasher zamam, but I don't get the punishment unless what? Both of us became edim zomimim. Now, what does that mean? It means that if your testimony still stands. Now, it's not going to be admissible in court because it's one witness, but I don't get the punishment of death unless both of us became accused, okay, of being edim zomimim. Now, why is this relevant? Well, now comes the logic. Now, if you thought the two brothers could testify or two cousins could testify together, that means that now I am only going to get killed because of your testimony. Because if I don't get killed if you don't become an eid zomim, and then I do get killed if you become an eid zomim, then you basically caused my death. Your testimony has caused my death. Now, there's a little bit, it's not exactly the case, and the Gemara is going to ultimately reject this and say, what do you mean? Not really. But the point is that in some kind of way, your testimony caused me to get killed because on account of your testimony that you lied, I also lied. But I won't get killed unless you also become an eid zomim, and if you hadn't lied, then I wouldn't have gotten killed. So you're causing me to get killed. And then basically it means that by being witnesses, we theoretically could actually be witnesses for each other, even though we weren't really trying to be. It's a bit of a backhanded way of saying this. It is logical, but yeah. Anyway, Amrle Rava, V'litamech, Haditnan, but wait a minute. Rava says that can't be. Because, look at this Mishnah we're going to remember from Bava Batra. In Bava Batra, we learned about Chezkat Shalosh Shanim. That means you could prove ownership of a land if you could prove that you lived and worked in the land and got the produce from the land, the proceeds from the land for 3 years. So, Haditnan, Shlosha Achim, Ve'echad Mitzarefim Mahem. Let's say there's 4 witnesses altogether. You could do it with 6, but let's just do it with 4. Sounds like they're talking about 4. 3 brothers, and 1 witness joins those 3 brothers. And each brother testifies about 1 year. So the first brother testifies with, let's call him Joe. First brother testifies with Joe about year 1. Second brother testifies with Joe about year 2. Third brother testifies with Joe about year 3. About each year, we have independent testimony. The brothers aren't testifying together. So it's accepted, even though in the end, the whole case is built on these 3 brothers. But they also have another witness with them. So there's always 2 witnesses that are good witnesses. So these are 3 eduyot. They're 3 testimonies, but they're hein edut echad lahazama. Now, let's say they're all found out to be liars, or one is found out to be liars. One group of witnesses was knocked out as edim zomimim. They're not going to get the punishment kasher zamam lasot lachiv, because to say the guy had the produce for 1 year is useless without the other 2 years. So therefore, it's all grouped together until the whole thing is huzam. No one's going to actually get punished. Now, you can throw the testimony out of court and nothing will happen, but you're not going to be able to convict the edim zomimim. So what do you see here? And this is true if we go by this, which is in the end, just like you said before, if you allow testimony like that, the one brother is going to cause the death of the other. Here, one brother causes another brother to pay money, if you're going to look at it in that way. But we don't look at it in that way, obviously, because this works. So Ela hazamame al makati. It's not the brother who caused the other brother to have to pay money. It's the fact that they lied under oath, and the fact that their edim who came who said you guys were with us at a different time. They're the ones who caused the punishment, not each one to each other. So Hachanami will say the same thing from the case before about what the logic Rami Brahma said about they won't get killed unless, right, one brother will kill the other. No, that's not true. Hazamame al-makate, and therefore that logic falls apart, which made sense because it wasn't so convincing. Second answer, Ela imken lichtov kra. We're back to the world of drashot then. Forget logic. We're going to prove it by a drasha. Ela imken lichtov kra uben alavot. Inami hem alavot, right? It says fathers shouldn't die for their sons' sins. Then it says, and sons shouldn't die for their father, right? It doesn't say sins, but sons shouldn't die for their father. Now, once it said sons already, right? The first part, it could have said in the second part, and a son for the father, or it could have just said they for the father, because it already referred to them as sons. So why does it say my ubanim, and sons won't die for the father? Afilu banim la'alma. From there, you get an extra, again, this is just a world of drasha, you get an extra thing, which is sons for each other, or again, cousins for each other, any relatives. Okay, another 3 questions, and then we'll move on to the sugyot about really, relatives and this relative and that relative and all the presentations that I know you're dying for. Eshkachan krovei ha'av, krovei ha'em minalan. So now we know that all we've been talking about right now is sons and fathers. That's all male relatives. What about through the mother, through the sister, through the, right? All those that we talked about. Remember in the Mishna, they said there was some version that all those aren't disqualified, but we learned that they are in the Mishna. And krovei ha'em minalan, where do we get it from? Amarkra avot avot tresimne, because it says avot al banim and then banim al avot. It didn't have to say avot twice. So what do we learn from there? This is a classic drasha. Well, since it's totally useless for its own purpose, it must be teaching about something else and something else kind of related. So it must be, no pun intended, but must be about the mother's relatives. Eshkachan, we're going to do the same type of drasha in another second. Eshkachan lechova. This is all about lo yumtu. They won't die. What about if they want to testify something good? It doesn't say that's a problem, right? Lischut minalan, to exonerate them, for example. Amarkra yumtu tresimne. Again, it says die in the first part, and it says die in the second part, right? Sons won't die for the father, father won't die for the sons. So if we already learned about for chova, then obviously learn also for zchut. Eshkachan, last question. B'dinei nefashot, b'dinei mamonot minan. The pasuk is all about death. What about having to pay money? Well, Amar Kra, this is a drasha we're going to learn in the beginning of the next chapter, the first Mishnah. Amar Kra, mishpat achad yelachem, mishpat hashaveh lachem. Mishpat achad yelachem, they understand the same rules apply both for dinei nefashot, both for dinei mamonot. Okay, not exactly all the same rules, but we'll get to that in the next chapter. It's going to compare. But this drasha actually this actually makes sense in the context there, because the context there, it's all about if you kill someone, if you injure someone's property, all sorts of, it mixes monetary and capital. And then it says there's one rule for everything. So they say that means that it's going to be the same. So whatever we learn for dinei nefashot will be true for dinei mamonot. Okay, now we get to our presentation. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to start going through these cases. So we start with Rav. Rav says the following, okay? And there's English here, and there's only one part where I ended up by accident not translating, but it's fine. It's not a part that really needs. Everything else is in English here. I'm a Rav. Achi abba lo ya'idli hu ubenova chatano. Okay, that already we have in the Mishnah. This is very simple. I'm going to remind you how this works, okay? And I might not have pointed this out yesterday. It was less important yesterday. But Yaakov is our main guy, and he's in black, okay? Now, why do I say he's in black? Because at some points, we're going to change who the main person is and turn someone else in black. And black is always going to be the person that we're talking about, that person's relatives, okay? So now, Yaakov is the guy we're talking about. I want to remind you, all the relatives we said in the Mishnah, like Achiv, Aviv, right? It obviously goes in both directions. If Yaakov can't testify for Yishmael, then Yishmael can't testify for Yaakov, right? It obviously goes in both directions. It was worded in one direction, your brother, your father's brother, okay? But obviously, it's the same thing. Your nephew, right? Your father's son, okay? Your brother's son, okay? So I'm just pointing that out. So he says, Achi Abba lo Ya'idli, my father's brother, so Yaakov's father is Yitzchak, his brother is Yishmael. Yishmael can't testify for me. Hu b'no v'chatano, okay? His son and his son-in-law. We've already learned this, okay. Comes Rav, and he adds here, now you already see something different here, different from everything we saw yesterday if you're looking at the presentation. This page now has, okay, 3 generations. I'm already at the next page. 3 generations. Everything yesterday had only 2. It was always someone in the generation above, right? Nothing, or someone in the generation below. It was never 3 generations. So that's going to be the big problem with Rav. So ani lo idlo, I can't testify for Yishmael, not just me, but also ani ubni v'chotani. Okay, not me, not my son, and not my son-in-law can't testify for Yishmael. That basically means, okay, Yaakov's son Reuven and Dina's husband, okay, can't testify for Yishmael. Yishmael is their great uncle. Now, we didn't talk about that relationship at all. So the Gemara now questions that and says, Amai, Havali Shlisha Barishon. That's a third generation to a first generation. Va'anan Sheni B'Sheni Tanan, Sheni Barishon Tanan. We had two people in the second generation, right? Like cousins. We had Sheni Barishon, nephew for uncle. But Shlisha Barishon, no Tanan, we didn't have anything third generation to first generation. They're already much more distant. Okay, and if the Mishnah didn't mention them, then who is Rav to start bringing up some more distant relation? Because again, as I said, the further you get down, the more. Now, before we move on, I want to point out one thing that Yaakov doesn't say. This is going to come up a few times, so I want you to see where it comes from. Yaakov says that Reuven, Yaakov's son, okay, third generation, can't testify for Yishmael. But notice he doesn't say that Reuven can't testify for Yishmael's son, okay? Meaning Yaakov's son can actually testify for Yaakov's first cousin. Now, why is that? That's called Shlishi B'Sheni. Third generation to second generation is actually, even though it sounds like it, it's more distant than third generation to first generation. And that's what I explained to you before, because the connection to Yishmael and Yitzchak, okay, forget that Yishmael and Yitzchak weren't that close, but assuming, right, brothers, that's where the closeness starts from. So the more you get down further generations, they get more distant. So Reuven to Yaakov's cousin is actually more distant than Reuven to Yishmael. Okay, right? Like you might have a better relationship. Now you might not, but you might have a better relationship with your great uncles than you do with your parents' cousins. Okay, sometimes yes, sometimes no, but that's the basic idea. I think we can all understand that in a kind of real life experience. This is very real to life. So just remember that Rav doesn't say Shlisha B'Sheni is a problem. Okay, that's going to be an important thing that we're going to come back to. But the point here is, before we get to that, is that Shlisha B'Rishon is forbidden, a third generation to the first generation, meaning a person to his great uncle. And the Mishnah never talked about that. So the first, we're going to have three answers for Rav. The first two will be rejected. My chatano de katani b'matnitin. You want to find a source for it in the Mishnah? Well, when the Mishnah says chatano, which we said is the son-in-law, which is second generation, litne, my chatano de katani b'matnitin, chatan bino. Don't think Chatan is son-in-law. Forget the pictures from yesterday. It's not the son-in-law. It is. It's the son-in-law, but it's also the son-in-law of the son. Meaning, this is actually more than what it means. What it means is, if Yaakov, right, Ishmael can't testify for Yaakov, and neither can his son and his son-in-law, when it says my uncle and hem, b'nehem, v'chotnehem, chotnehem actually means third generation, and it means also not just Ishmael, his son and his son-in-law, which we had three, right? Each person was actually three people, but it's also going to include Yishmael's son's son. Okay, this shouldn't be Reuven and Dinah. This is a mistake, but whatever. The son's son and the son's daughter's son-in-law, basically the third generation. Okay, and that means third generation's already included there. Okay, third generation can't testify for Yaakov. Now, this is a little tricky because, and we're going to see this in a second, that means that third generation can't testify for Yaakov. Now, we already said in the previous, right, that he didn't have a problem with the third generation testifying for Yaakov, right? He just had a problem with third generation testifying for first generation, but he didn't say that third generation was a problem for him. So we're going to get to that problem right now. But before we get to that problem, we have a different problem. So we basically changed the word chatan to be chatan beno, which really means not just chatan beno, but also ben beno, meaning the grandson and the grandson-in-law. So litni ben beno. Well, it should have said the basic, the more obvious case, the grandson. Why did it say chatan beno? Well, mata agav orcha kamashmal. I wanted to teach you something, by the way, which is baal ki ishto. Okay, they wanted to teach the son-in-law because they wanted to say not only the son, also the son-in-law, because the husband is like the wife. We're going to get back to this soon. The husband is like the wife, and therefore, right, if Yishmael's granddaughter is a woman, her husband's going to be just the same as her and can't testify for Yaakov. Now, the problem is, there's another problem, which is, Ela hadatani Rabbi Chia, Shmona Avot, Shehem Esrim Va'arba. This is my favorite diagram. Okay, so Rabbi Chia said, there's 8 avot. Here's where I forgot to translate, okay? But it's not so difficult because basically what Rabbi Chia said, now if you remember in the Mishnah, there were 10 cases. One of the 10 cases was the chorgo. And the chorgo we said was levado, not beno v'chotano. Rabbi Chia apparently had a different version. He said there's 8 cases that have bino v'chotano, not 9. But he said there's 8 avot, basically, main categories, right? That's achiv, achi aviv, achi avimo, baal achoto, all those, okay? All the cases in the Mishnah other than horgo and, right, the stepson and the brother-in-law. Those are the 2 that are a little different than everything else because they're all just through marriage, right? Already more distant. He says there's 8 categories with 24, okay? Meaning altogether it's 24. Why? Because each 8 is hem, b'nehem, v'chonehem, which includes, right, it's 1, 2, 3. So 8 times 3 is 24. It's very simple. So for every person, there's a son and a son-in-law, and that gets you to 24 people. But according to, if we say chatan is chatan bino, which includes third to first generation, which was what we were trying to find, well, then it should be 32. Now, it really should be 40. I'm just pointing out because it's the son's son-in-law and it's the son's son. Okay. But since they use the word in chatan bino, they kind of ignore the grandson right now. Okay. But theoretically, it should be 5 for everything and it should be 40, but they call it 32. Okay. Because they're just basically adding the chatan bino. And then Rabbi Chia makes no sense. So we reject this answer. Okay. Going back. Again, our problem is, how does Rav talk about that the great uncle is forbidden to, right? The great uncle and the nephew and the great nephew are forbidden to each other. How does he get there? If, right, basically, how does he get to an extra generation if in the Mishnah it didn't talk about it? So we go back and we say, Lo'olam chatano mamash. Chatan really means chatan. Amai kari le chatan bino, but it's kind of like chatan bino. Why do they call it chatan bino? In other words, we'll go back and say it is chatan bino, but it doesn't really mean the chatan of his son. What it means is really the chatan. But kevan deme alma ka'ate kedor acher dami. Because he comes from outside the family, it's as if it's third generation. And that's why I drew him kind of here like in the middle. He's kind of like another generation. A son-in-law is so distant that it's like third to first. Okay? So now they say, wait a minute. That means, though, if we're going to say the son-in-law is like a third generation, then we're saying the third generation is forbidden to Yaakov. That means third generation is forbidden to second generation, right? It wasn't saying the third generation is forbidden to the great uncle. It was saying there in the Mishnah, Hatam of Yishmael is forbidden to Yaakov. So that means that's a third generation for a second generation. And now I brought in the picture here the case where we said Yaakov permits shlishi b'sheni, because Yaakov never said that his son Reuven is forbidden to his first cousin. And basically that's what we'd be saying. The son-in-law, which is if a third generation, would be forbidden to Yaakov. That's a third generation to a second generation. And that's not what Rav says. So this answer doesn't work either. So we're going to give a third answer for Rav. So the first 2 answers tried to square Rav away with the Mishnah and say that somehow in the Mishnah we have a reference to third generation. There is no reference to third generation in the Mishnah. We have to try some other method. And Rav da Amar Rabbi Elazar. He must hold like Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Elazar has a totally different opinion. He appears in a Braita, Titania. Rabbi Elazar Omel, Kashem she'achi abba lo ya'id li, hu b'no v'chatano. Just like Ishmael, right, my uncle, can't testify for me. He is son and his son-in-law. Also, his son, okay, again, it's Reuven and Dinah, it shouldn't be. It's Yishmael's grandchildren, right? Yishmael's grandchildren and son-in-law, grandson-in-law, cannot testify for me either. Now, this is a little tricky because this is Shlishi B'Sheni, and Rav doesn't hold Shlishi B'Sheni, so we're going to ask that question. So if you're wondering that, it's a problem. But again, you have to remember, this is basic, that Shlishi B'Sheni, if Reuven can testify for Yaakov, then it's not Reuven, but whoever this guy, right? We'll call him Reuven, but forget about him right now. Sorry, whoops, I just moved forward. Didn't mean to do that. Okay, go back. Okay, if Yishmael's grandson can't testify for Yaakov, then it also obviously means that he can't testify for Yitzchak either, right? Because again, the third generation is always going to be closer to the first generation than they are to the second generation. So basically, we're going to say, that's Rav, because here we see third and first generation, even though it's not talked about directly. So now the Gemara is going to ask, but still, exactly what I pointed out, of Kati Avale Shlishi B'Sheni, but Rav Achshir Shlishi B'Sheni. Rav says third generation is permitted to second generation. So this definitely, right, this is a problem. This doesn't make any sense. This can't be Rav. Rav can't hold like Rabbi Elazar because Rav disagrees with Rabbi Elazar. And that is maybe with the Shlishi B'Rishon, but not the Shlishi B'Sheni. To which the Gemara answers, the obvious answer, which is Rav Savar le Kavate B'Chada Upaligale B'Chada. As I said, Rabbi Elazar, her whole question, I just want to make it clear because I know this is complicated. Rav is basically saying first generation to third generation is a problem, right? Great uncle to great nephew is forbidden. Where does he get that from? It's not in the Mishnah. Well, it is in derive Rabbi Elazar, right? Because if Rabbi Elazar forbids Ishmael's grandson to Yaakov, then he obviously forbids Ishmael's grandson to Yitzchak, to the grandfather himself, right? To the great uncle. So now we're going to say that Rav holds like Rabbi Elazar in one issue and disagrees with him in the other. He is like Rabbi Elazar in the sense that Yitzchak and Ruvain, okay, great nephew is a problem. But he's not like Rabbi Elazar in the sense that he doesn't think Sheni b'Shlishi, okay? He doesn't, or Shlishi b'Sheni. He doesn't think that Yishmael's grandson is forbidden to Yaakov. So he holds like him part and part. Okay, let's read it inside. He agrees with him about one element, not about the other. My time of So now what's the disagreement based on? Lo yumtu avot al banim ubanim. This is the way we do it, where we don't stop it where the pasuk should have a break. We go one more word. Father shouldn't die for sons and sons. What does that mean? And sons? L'rabot dor acher. That means we're going to go another generation. So we're going to say not only can Yaakov Yaakov can't testify for Yishmael, but also Yaakov's son can't testify for Yishmael, right? Or just like Yishmael's son can't testify for Yaakov, also, or his son can't testify for Yitzchak. Let's say also his grandson can't testify for Yitzchak. That's to basically bring it down another generation. But Rabbi Elazar says al banim. Amar Rahman. Why does it say ubanim and then it says lo yamutu avot al banim? What's puzzle for the father, like what's puzzle for Yitzchak, that Reuven can't testify for him, is thrown onto his own son. So whoever's puzzle for the father is going to be puzzle for the son as well. And that, in the end, is the way we explain Rav, that Rav doesn't hold by our Mishnah, because our Mishnah really doesn't mention third generation. He holds like Rabbi Elazar, he just doesn't agree with him across the board. He thinks first and third, but already when you get to third to second, they're already more distant, and that goes back to what I said in the beginning. So if you didn't get all the ins and outs, the main thing to understand here is the difference between first and third generation and third and second generation, because again, the more the family tree spreads out, the more distant the people get from each other. Okay, now we're getting to Rav Nachman. I'm Rav Nachman. Achi chamoti lo ya'idli, ben achi chamoti lo ya'idli, ben acho chamoti lo ya'idli. It sounds a little complicated, but it's really not. Okay, Yaakov's married to Leah. Their parents, right? Her parents are Lavan and his wife. So now we're focusing on the wife. The wife is the mother-in-law. That's chamoti. Now, when we take Leah's mother, okay, we have Leah's mother's sister and Leah's mother's brother. So we're going to start with the brother. The brother is forbidden to Yaakov, okay, his mother-in-law's brother, and the mother-in-law's brother's son, and the sister's son, okay, the mother-in-law's sister's son. So it's basically everyone from the mother-in-law's family, the males, right? The brother, the son of the brother, and the son of the sister. Now, comes Rav Nachman and he says, okay, so here's the mother-in-law's brother. We're going to focus only on that. That's why everyone else is faded. So he says, Achi chamoti lo ya'idli, and then the continuation is Tanatuna. Tanatuna means, well, that's actually found in the Mishnah. And here, if you notice, we're going to switch the brother to black, because now we're going to say that even though Rav Nachman says this as if we never heard this, no one was talking about the mother-in-law's relatives, but yes, it was actually in the Mishnah. Because why? Because if you take Baal Achoto and you flip who the central character is, and instead of saying who's forbidden to Yaakov, we're going to say Yaakov's relationship to this person, okay, this brother of the mother-in-law. Let's go through. This brother, his relationship, Lavan's relationship to the brother is what? Lavan is his husband's his sister's husband, right? Did I say that right? Sister's husband? No, it's the sister's, right? Yeah. The brother's sister's husband is Lavan. Okay, when you start with the brother, his sister's, which is Lavan's wife, husband is Lavan. Now, that's Baal Achoto. That was the case in the Mishnah. Now, What's the chatan of that? Chatan ba'alachoto, the son-in-law is Yaakov. Lavan's son-in-law is Yaakov. So there you have it. So achi chamuti is the same as ba'alachoto because you do it in the reverse. Okay, we're going to do the same exact thing with the next one. Okay, ben achi chamuti, which is the son of that guy, that brother. Okay, so that's his relationship to Yaakov. He's the son of his mother-in-law's brother. And now, if you go the reverse, this is going to be the Tanatuna Bal Achot Aviv. Okay, what's Bal Achot Aviv? The husband of my father's sister. Who's right? So his father is the brother of Lavan's wife, and her husband is Lavan, and the son-in-law of that person is Yaakov. So it's the exact same relationship as Bal Achot Aviv, which was in the Mishnah, because again, he's the chatan of the Bal Achot Aviv. Okay, and the same thing with Ben Achot Chamuti Lo Ya'ili, which is the son of Lavan's wife's sister, okay, her son. And again, we're going to go in the reverse. It's Baal Achot Imo, which is the same as Baal Achot Aviv, right? This is his mother's sister's husband, which is Lavan, and the son-in-law is Yaakov. Okay, so we just did that. We flipped the cases in the Mishnah and said if you look at them in the reverse, right, you get to that. Okay, we're going to stay on this slide because I didn't make slides for the next one because it's the exact same thing, but instead of Lavan's wife and the mother-in-law of Yaakov, it's through the father-in-law of Yaakov, which is Lavan. Okay, so if you do the exact same chart about Lavan, it'll be the flip of other cases. We're going to see that right now. Amarav Ashi Kiavina Beit Ula, when I was at Ula's house, Beit Midrash, they asked me, Achi Chamiv Mahu, okay, the brother of my father-in-law, which is again the same as the brother of the mother-in-law, Ben Achi Chamiv Mahu, the son of that brother of my father-in-law, and Ben Achot Chamiv, and the son of the sister of my father-in-law, right? Lavan's son, Lavan's sister's son, Lavan's brother's son, and Lavan's brother. Mahu, are they forbidden? Amralan, Tadichu, of course, look in the Mishnah. Again, reverse case of Achiv, Achi Aviv, and Achi Imo, right? Instead of the husband of Achoto and the husband of Achot, right? This is all his brother and his brother and his father's brother and his mother's brother. Okay, and then you would get to the exact same thing on Lavan's side. And again, Yaakov would be the chatan of those characters and would be forbidden. Okay, so since Yaakov is forbidden to them, they're forbidden to Yaakov because obviously it goes in both directions. Okay, next case. Rav Ikla. Okay, Rav. Now we're looking at the next picture here. Rav Ikla Mizban Gvile. He went to buy parchments, or to sell parchments. Balmine. They asked him. Okay, can a person testify for the wife of his stepson? Remember, we said the stepson, not the son, not the son-in-law. But what about, so Yaakov's married to Leah, and Leah has an ex-husband, and she has a child with that husband. So can you testify? Basur amre bal keishto, but pubedita amre isha kebala. Okay, so most people think there's no difference whether you say it, a husband is like his wife or a wife is like a husband. And basically, the point is, yes, if you can't testify for the son, then you can't testify for his wife either because you're considered related. Okay, because whatever is true for the son is going to be true for his wife. Now, this is interesting, and you can listen to Sugya B'Tana in Hebrew. It's coming out later today, Merav Tubal Kahana, about this, what the halachic, where we use Baal Ki'ishto and Isha Kabbalah in halacha, because it's not always true, right? You can't always have your husband do everything for you and say, oh, I don't have to do this mitzvah, my husband did it for me. But sometimes, yes. So it's a good question where this applies. So anyway. How do we know Minayin Shaisha? Da'amar Rafuna Amarav. Rafuna said in the name of Rav. Minayin Shaisha Kabbalah. How do you know that this is true? That a woman is like her husband? Dichtiv Ervat Achi Avicha Lo Tegale. It says, don't reveal the erva of meaning don't sleep with your uncle's wife. And then it says Elishto Lo Tikrav. Don't go near his wife. Dodatchai, because she's your aunt. Now they say, hello, Eshet Dodohi. She's the wife of your uncle. She's not your aunt, right? Your aunt is your father's sister. This is not your father's sister. This is your father's brother's wife. Michlal Isha Kebala. So from there you learn that Isha Kebala, because they call her your aunt, even though not. Now we're going to ask a difficulty on the Mishnah. Baal Imo, okay, the case in the Mishnah was your wife's child. Okay, I'm sorry, the husband of your wife and his child, Hu Benova Chotano. Okay, now we actually depicted this differently, and I depicted it here this way right now because this is the way the Gemara first understands it. That Yitzchak was married to Rivka, and let's say they got divorced or he died, either which way, and now she gets remarried, and she has a son. Now, either she has a son. Yesterday, we actually explained that he had a son with a different wife, Okay, there's two ways there could be a son here. So hu beno v'chatano, he and his sons, and his son-in-law. Now the question is it the son the second husband has with Yaakov's mother, or is it a son the second husband has with some other wife? So right now the Gemara thinks, we drew it yesterday differently, but right now the Gemara thinks beno hainu achiv. It's actually Rivka's child with her second husband. They say, but that son of Baal Imo is forbidden not because he's the son of Baal Imo. He's forbidden because he's the brother of Yaakov. They share the same mother. So we're going to have two answers to this question. Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah, lo nitzcha ela lachiach. Rabbi Yirmiyah says you got the chart all wrong. It's not the son of Rivka. It's as we put it yesterday. It's her second husband's wife, right? Her second husband has another wife or had another wife or whatever it is. Could be married now to both of them and had a son with her. And they're not related at all, but they're forbidden anyway. Why? He says, achia ach. Now here it's very interesting. It sounds like, why is this son forbidden? Because this son has a half-brother who's also a half-brother of Yaakov. They share the same half-brother, which would mean something very interesting. The son of the second husband would only be forbidden if the Rivka and that second husband actually had a child, because there's a connection between them through that ach, through the brother of Yaakov, through his mother, right? They share a mother and they share the same father. So it's the brother's brother. Okay? Now, Rav Chisda said, no, he's not a relative, that son. They're so unrelated. And the Mishna is actually talking about the original son, Rivka's son. Okay, now the Gemara is going to have to ask. So the Gemara says to him, wait a minute, how could you say that, Rav Chisda? But you didn't hear what Rabbi Yirmiyah said, that he is forbidden. He says, sorry, I went ahead. No, I didn't hear that, meaning I don't buy that. I don't agree with it. So now Rav Chisda, we're back to question one, which is if it's really the brother through the mother of Yaakov, why do you have to mention brother? All right, the son of her husband is actually his brother. So why mention that twice in the Mishnah? So the answer is Tan achiv min ha'av, katani achiv min ha'em. When it said brother, it meant brother through the father, which, by the way, if you remember from Yavamo, right, often the brother is the brother through the father. And the Baal Imo is coming to teach you, and his son is coming to teach you if you share the same mother. And we have two basic approaches to how to view this case. I'm Rav Chisda. This is a super easy one. Avi chatam v'avi kalam yidim zalzeh. We call them mechutanim, right? The machatanim. The father of the groom and the mother of the groom, okay, are not related to the father of the bride and the mother of the bride, okay? So, and you call them groom, bride, husband, wife, it doesn't matter, okay? But they can testify. They have a nice image here. Elaki achla didana, like the lid on a barrel, because a lid is a lid and a barrel is a barrel. They're two different things. They do go together, but they're two very different things and they're not related to each other. Amar Rabba Bar Bar Chana, Me'ir Adam L'ishto Arusa. He says a person can testify for a betrothed woman. Okay, he's betrothed to someone, they're not yet married, he can testify. But we're going to have two things here. First, Ravina is going to limit it, and then the Gemara is going to say it's not even true. Amar Ravina, Lo Amaran Ela Lafuke Mina. This is only to take money away from her. But he'll be believed. But to say she's owed money, no way, no how, because her money is eventually going to become his money. Remember, all her stuff goes to him in the end. Right, somewhat, right? He ends up being able to benefit from it. Vilohi. But now the Gemara says this whole thing isn't true. Loshna lafuke loshna liyu lo meheman. He can't testify for her at all. Why not? My datech. So he says, why did you think he could? He goes back to the original opinion. Rabbi Baruch Chana says, what were you thinking? Were you thinking if you're a Kohen, you don't go into mourning for her, you don't become impure to her, and she doesn't go into onem for him. Okay, this is a little weird. There's a whole question on this. There's no isser for her as Kohen, but anyway, we're going to put that aside. If she dies, he doesn't inherit her. If he dies, then she gets to get her ketubah. But if he dies, he doesn't inherit her. Why not? Well, both that law and the law about the Kohanim, hatam b'she'irot halarachmana. The pasuk says only the she'iro karov elav. Okay, and by the property, it also says she'iro, as if like she's very close to him, meaning their bodies were close to each other, which doesn't happen during the betrothal period. Akati lav she'iro, she's not yet. But that's by those laws. But those laws don't apply here when it comes to testimony because this is because you love someone so much. And he already feels that way about her. He wants to marry her. So he already can't testify for her. Chorgo levado. Next sugya. Now we're going to go into this issue where I brought up Rabbi Chia before, how he only has 8 and the Mishnah had 9, right? And basically the Rabbi Chia seems to exclude 2 people from the list, not just the Chorgo levado, but we're going to see it's the Giso. Okay. Now we're going to have 2 Brightot. One is Tanakama and Rabbi Yossi. One is Tanakama and Rabbi Yehuda. We're going to assume that the unnamed Tana in each one is the opposite, meaning in the Rabbi Yehuda Breita, it's going to be Rabbi Yossi. In the Rabbi Yossi Breita, it's going to be Rabbi Yehuda. So we're going to bring 2 Breita, but basically say that Rabbi Yossi is going to be Tanakama, and they're both saying the same thing. And Rabbi Yehuda is going to be Tanakama and the other one, and they're both saying the same thing. And that won't change. That will be till, we'll still, even though we're going to have some questions, that's the assumption here. Tanu Rabbanan, Chorgo levado. Rabbi Yossi Omer Giso. Okay, so one says Chorgo, and one says it's the geese who's without the sons and sons-in-law. But Tani Idach, a different Braita says Giso levado, and Rabbi Yehuda Omer Chorgo. So again, Rabbi Yehuda's Chorgo, and he's in the first Tana against Rabbi Yossi, and he appears here. And where it says Giso levado in this Braita, that's Rabbi Yossi who said Giso in the other one. Now, the Gemara is not sure what they mean. Do they mean each one, or do they mean both? So right now the Gemara says, my kamar. Ilay mahachi kamar. If you want to say that when he says Chorgo levado, Rabbi Yehuda, he means Chorgo levado v'huadin legiso. Chorgo en giso. And ata Rabbi Yossi lememar giso levado v'huadin lechorgo. And they basically say the same thing. It's just a matter of what's their starting point. Which one is the main one and which one is just like that one? And then both of them, though, think that both are on the outs. Neither one has the beno v'chotano. Well, then we're going to have a problem because we assume if they're debating this in these 2 Brightot, they must be the only opinions. And then our Mishnah matches nobody because our Mishnah has only Chorgo levado. So Elamat needs in Dikatani Giso, who beno v'chotano, mani, lo Rabbi Yehuda, lo Rabbi Yossi. Then our Mishnah doesn't match either opinion. Elahachi kamar must be Chorgo levado, aval Giso, hu beno v'chotano. The Rabbi Yehuda, when he says Chorgo, that's our Mishnah. Only the stepson is by himself. Everybody else, hu beno v'chotano. And Rabbi Yossi, when he says Giso levado, what he means is aval Giso levado, aval Chorgo hu beno. After Rabbi Yossi lemem Giso levado, aval Chorgo hu beno v'chotano. Now, if you're going to say right now, they're going to think that each one is taking out a different one. Rabbi Yehuda is like our Mishnah, the Choreg is levad, and Rabbi Yossi is a different opinion, which is the geese is out. The Chorgo is like everybody else, hu beno v'chotano, against our Mishnah. But then we have a problem with Rabbi Chia because we need to find someone who takes 2 people out. Okay, so they started with both take 2 people out. That doesn't match our Mishnah. Neither takes 2 people out. Well, then Rabbi Chia doesn't match anyone. Because each one thinks there's 9. It's just a different 9. Elahachi kamar. Must be like this. Chorgo levado, aval giso hu beno v'chotano. That's Rabbi Yehuda. That's our Mishnah. And ata Rabbi Yossi lememar giso levado v'kol sheken chorgo. Rabbi Yossi, in other words, one of them says only one is out. That's Rabbi Yehuda. That's our Mishnah. Who matches Rabbi Chia? Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi says we're going to take out the choreg and the geese. They're both exceptions to the rule. And the Manitim Rabbi Yehuda and Braita, which is Rabbi Chia, is like Rabbi Yossi. Now, Rabbi Yehuda says in the name of Shmuel, Halach Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel, Halachah ke Rabbi Yossi. We pass them like Rabbi Yossi against our Mishnah, it sounds like, which is Chorgo levado and Giso levado, and not their children. But, pay close attention, according to this, the geese is pasul, right? The geese is a relative, just not his son and his son-in-law. Now, in the Mishnah, remember Rabbi Yossi said there was this early Mishnah that said that the geese isn't a problem. Why did he think the geese is not a problem? Because everything only goes through whoever can inherit. And a brother-in-law can't inherit, and because it goes through the woman, right? And Rabbi Yossi in the Mishnah thinks the geese is out entirely. Rabbi Yossi now thinks that the geese is in, right, as a problem, just not the son and son-in-law. So we have a bit of a contradiction with Rabbi Yossi, and we're going to have a bit of a lack of clarity when Rabbi Yehuda said halacha is like Rabbi Yossi. Did he mean Rabbi Yossi in the Mishnah and that a geese can actually testify? Or did he mean Rabbi Yossi in the Braita that a geese can't, right? The Rabbi Yossi we just explained, a geese can't testify, his sons and his sons-in-law can, but that's not important to us, okay? So, there was a case that came before Rav Yosef, 2 brothers-in-law were signed on it. Now, what do we mean by brothers-in-law? Okay, we'll put the things back up. We assume we mean by brother-in-law, okay, what you would say. There's Rachel and Leah are sisters, and Rachel's married to Yonatan, and Rachel's married to David, okay? David and Yonatan, and they each married, and they're not related to each other. So there was a matana like this with 2 gisim. Savar of Yosef l'achshura. Rav Yosef wanted to say this is a fine. because they're gisim. And Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel halakha Rabbi Yossi, and he thought Rabbi Yossi in the Mishnah, who said that anyone related through the wives is not a problem because they can't inherit each other. Amarle Abaye. So Abaye comes and starts questioning Rabbi Yossi. Remember, he was a student, but he often questioned him. Why do you think that when he passed like Rabbi Yossi was talking about that? Dilma Rabbi Yossi debraite de possibly giso. Maybe it's this Rabbi Yossi that we just learned who said gis is a problem, just not the sons and son-in-law. To which he says, Rabbi Yossi says, I don't think so, lo sagdata, because I'm going to quote something else Shmuel said. Da Amar Shmuel, kigon ana upinchas, da avinan achi v'gise. Now, came Shmuel and he said, what's an example of geese? He said, like me and Pinchas. Now, here's a picture of him and Pinchas. Him and Pinchas were brothers, and they married two sisters. He says, we're ache and we're gise. That's the case of a geese that's pasul, which sounds like aval gise de alma shapir dami. But if they were gisim like the previous picture, where they weren't related to each other and only through the wives, it sounds like Shmuel holds like Rabbi Yossi that a regular geese who doesn't happen to be two brothers married to two sisters would actually be able to testify for each other. So again, he wants to say, I can accept this document and rule based on it. So he says, Dilma kigon anu Pinchas mishum degiso kamar. So Abai says, what do you mean? He could have been using him and Pinchas just because he happens to be his brother-in-law. Maybe he was focusing on the brother-in-law element, not the fact that they were two brothers. And maybe he thinks that two gisim can't testify against each other either. So Amarle, he says, fine. Okay, Abai, you're giving me problems. You won't let me. Now, what's the idea? There's a shtar matana. The guy wants to get the gift. He wants to take the land, let's say. He was given land. He wants to get the land based on the shtar. But the problem is there's these two brothers-in-law signed on it, and Abai won't let him. So he says, fine, I'll give you a different solution to do this. Zil kanya be'edim asir to Rabbi Elazar. Let's go back to Rabbi Elazar from Gitin. Forget this, the edim on the document. Go by, were there witnesses that saw you get this shtar matana from the guy? Then we can go based on that. Comes Abai and he says, that doesn't work either. Ha'amar Rabbi Yabi is really giving him a hard time. Mode Rabbi Elazar b'bezuaf mitochashu pasul. If the document itself is disqualified, and here it was because there's false, right? There's witnesses that are not allowed to testify for each other, or at least potentially. We're not sure. That was the whole question. What's the pasak like Rabbi Yossi? So no way. So Amarle, he goes back to Rav Yosef goes back to the guy who has the shtar matana in his hand. He says, Zil, sorry, you got to go. Lo shav kelei dot v'nalaf. They're not letting me give it to you. Sorry, I tried my best, but I can't help you. Okay, end of the daf. We're almost there. Rabbi Yehuda Omer. Rabbi Yehuda in the Mishnah had said, remember there was karov and itrachek if they were married and then got divorced, or she died, then the husband is no longer connected. But we said if they have children, Rabbi Yehuda came and said if they have children, then they are connected. So now the question is, do we hold like Rabbi Yehuda or not? So Amar Rabbi Tanchum, Amar Rabbi Tabla, Amar Bron, Amar Rav, halakha ki Rabbi Yehuda. Rav Amar Rav Nachman, ein halakha ki Rabbi Yehuda. So we have a debate here. V'chein Amar Rav Bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. We quote another person who quotes Rabbi Yochanan saying ein halakha ki Rabbi Yehuda. However, this last statement of Rav Bar Chana, some people say he didn't say it about this. We don't hold like Rabbi Yehuda. He said about something else which is somewhat connected. Some people think he said about this, and with this we'll finish for today. It's zo darash Rabbi Yossi Aglili. Ubata ela kohanim haliviyim ve'ela shofet asher yeh bayamim ahem. V'chita alel da'atcha shata olechet shel shofet shelo haya b'yamav. What do you mean? What you're going to go to the shofet that lived 100 years ago? Of course not. You can only go to the shofet that's living in your time. What does that tell you? Well, it means it means someone who used to be related to you and is no longer. You can go to someone who's now okay to you because you're no longer related because the person died. Now, this doesn't talk about if there's kids, not kids. It just talks about that law. And Amar Rabbi Chanan, Rabbi Yochanan, Lachak Rabbi Yossi Aglili. And he said, we hold like Rabbi Yossi Aglili. And he didn't say anything about Rabbi Yochanan, according to this reading, about Rabbi Yehuda. And we're left with that. Okay, so unclear if we hold like Rabbi Yehuda or not, and unclear if Rabbi Yochanan held like Rabbi Yehuda or not. Okay, because maybe he didn't even talk about Rabbi Yehuda, and he was talking about Rabbi Yossi Aglili. Okay, with that, we finish our daf. We don't really have time to go over it, but you can use the slides, the presentation. You can go over things if you want. And with that, we're going to finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day and maybe hear good news.